September 5, 1945. Changi Prison, Singapore. The midday heat pressed down like a physical weight as Sergeant Thomas Fairfield of the 2nd Battalion, Royal Norfolk Regiment, pushed open the rusted gate of Block 7. The stench hit him first. 3 years of neglect, disease, and death had created an odor that no tropical breeze could disperse. Then came the silence. Not peaceful quiet, but the terrible hush of people too weak to make sound. In the corner of the first cell, something moved. Fairfield's eyes, still adjusting to the dim interior after the brilliant sunlight, struggled to make sense of what he was seeing. A skeletal figure, gender unclear beneath layers of filth and torn fabric, crawled toward a bowl of fetid water. The figure's arms were no thicker than Fairfield's wrists. Every rib stood out in stark relief. Open sores covered what little skin was visible. The figure looked up. Despite the sunken cheeks and hollow eyes, Fairfield realized he was looking at a woman. She couldn't have been more than 30, though suffering had aged her beyond recognition. Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. She was trying to speak. Fairfield knelt down, setting aside his rifle. He pulled his canteen from his belt and held it to her lips. The woman's eyes went wide with terror. She flinched backward, raising stick-thin arms to protect her face. "It's all right," Fairfield said softly, his Yorkshire accent thick with emotion. "You're safe now. You're mine now. I've got you." The woman stared at him. Slowly, she lowered her arms. Fairfield helped her drink, supporting her head as she took tiny sips of clean water for the first time in months. When she finished, she whispered 2 words in a voice like dried leaves. "Thank you." Behind Fairfield, Corporal James Morrison appeared in the doorway. His face had gone pale beneath his tan. "Sarge, you need to see the rest of the block. There are dozens more. Women, children. Dear God, Sarge, what have they done to them?" What Sergeant Fairfield and the men of the Royal Norfolk Regiment discovered that September morning would become one of the most profound testimonies to both human cruelty and human compassion of the Second World War. In the weeks that followed, British soldiers would demonstrate that even after 6 years of brutal warfare, even after witnessing horrors across 3 continents, they could still respond to suffering with remarkable humanity. The liberation of Singapore's prison camps would reveal not just Japanese war crimes, but something equally important: the determination of ordinary British soldiers to restore dignity to the broken, food to the starving, and hope to the hopeless. The fall of Singapore on February 15, 1942, had been Britain's worst military defeat. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival surrendered approximately 85,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops to a Japanese force less than half that size. What followed was 3.5 years of captivity that killed more than 12,000 Allied prisoners. The mortality rate was staggering. 1 in 4 prisoners died in Japanese captivity in Southeast Asia, compared to roughly 4% in German camps. But the military prisoners, terrible as their suffering was, were not alone. Singapore had housed approximately 50,000 British civilians when it fell: teachers, merchants, engineers, doctors, and their families. The Japanese interned them all. Women were separated from men. Children over 12 were torn from their mothers. The camps operated under a philosophy fundamentally different from anything in the European theater. The Japanese viewed surrender as the ultimate disgrace. Soldiers who surrendered forfeited their right to be treated as human beings. The Geneva Conventions, which Japan had signed but never ratified, were ignored. Prisoners received approximately 600 calories daily, when they received food at all. Medical care was non-existent. Disease ran rampant. Punishment for minor infractions included beating, torture, and execution. The women's camps were particularly horrific. Changi Prison, originally built for 600 inmates, held over 4,000 women and children by 1943. Sime Road Camp housed another 3,000. These facilities lacked adequate water, sanitation, or shelter. Cholera, dysentery, malaria, and beriberi killed dozens weekly. Malnutrition killed even more. Mrs. Margaret Driberg, a missionary teacher interned at Changi, kept a diary throughout her captivity. Her entries, recovered after the war, provide haunting documentation of the camp's decline. July 1943. Rice ration reduced again. Half cup twice daily, sometimes with thin vegetable soup. Women too weak to stand for morning count. Guards beat those who collapse. September 1943. Young Sally Henderson died today, age 7. Malnutrition and dysentery. Her mother had been giving the child her own rations. Mrs. Henderson weighs perhaps 70 pounds now. I don't think she will survive much longer. January 1944. We have become invisible to the guards. They look through us, not at us. We are already ghosts. Margaret Driberg died in April 1945, just 4 months before liberation. She weighed less than 60 pounds. She was 53 years old. The mathematics of starvation in Japanese camps were brutally simple. An adult woman requires approximately 1,800 calories daily to maintain basic health. Women doing physical labor need substantially more, often 2,500 calories or higher. The Japanese provided 600 calories, consisting almost entirely of rice, often rotten or filled with weevils. There were no vegetables, no protein, no fats. The human body, deprived of essential nutrients, begins consuming itself. First goes the fat, then muscle tissue, finally organs. Medical records recovered from Changi document the progression. By 1944, 98% of women prisoners suffered from beriberi, a vitamin B deficiency causing nerve damage, heart failure, and death. 85% had malaria. 70% suffered from chronic dysentery. 50% had tropical ulcers, open sores that wouldn't heal and often became gangrenous, requiring amputation with no anesthetic. The children suffered most. Young bodies require more calories relative to weight than adults. Growing children need proper nutrition or face permanent developmental damage. In the camps, children stopped growing. Infant mortality approached 70%. Those who survived bore physical and psychological scars that would never fully heal. Sister Margot Turner, a British nurse interned at Sime Road, testified after the war. We had no medicines, no bandages, no antiseptic. When children died, we had nothing to wrap their bodies in. Mothers would give up their own clothing to shroud their children. By 1945, women were wearing literal rags. Some had no clothing at all, just strips of cloth tied around their waists. The Japanese response to this suffering was indifference bordering on contempt. Camp Commandant Colonel Sumida, tried for war crimes in 1946, defended his actions. They were prisoners. Prisoners do not deserve comfort. The Imperial Japanese Army operated under extreme supply difficulties. We provided what we could spare. The records show otherwise. Japanese guards in Singapore camps maintained healthy weights throughout the war. Japanese Army warehouses discovered after liberation contained thousands of Red Cross parcels intended for prisoners, never distributed. Medical supplies sent by the International Red Cross sat unused while prisoners died of treatable diseases. The cruelty was not necessity. It was policy. When British forces landed in Singapore on September 4, 1945, liberating the camps became the immediate priority. The Japanese had surrendered on August 15th, but communication with occupied territories was sporadic. Some Japanese commanders ignored the surrender for days or weeks. The condition of the prisoners was unknown, though rumors had filtered out through resistance networks. Major Robert Brownlee, medical officer attached to the 5th Indian Division, received orders on September 4th. Proceed to Changi Prison immediately. Assess prisoner health status and establish medical services. Take whatever supplies you need. Priority absolute. Brownlee assembled a team of 20 doctors and 60 nurses from the field ambulance units. They loaded trucks with medical supplies, food, and water. The convoy left Singapore city center at dawn on September 5th. They expected bad conditions. Nothing could have prepared them for what they found. Captain Patricia Hamlin, Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service, was in, the first vehicle through Changi's gates. Her diary entry from that day survives. The smell reached us before we entered. Death and decay and human waste. Then we saw them. Walking skeletons wearing rags. Women who might weigh 60 or 70 pounds. Children with stick limbs and swollen bellies. They moved slowly, if they moved at all. Most simply sat or lay where they were, too weak to rise. The British medical teams immediately established triage. The most critical patients needed intravenous fluids and immediate hospitalization. But there were over 3,000 women and children in Changi, and perhaps 40 beds available. Brownlee made an instant decision. Every building becomes a hospital. Every vehicle becomes an ambulance. We treat them here, now, all of them. Within hours, the British had established something unprecedented. A field hospital for 3,000 patients. Nurses moved through the blocks, assessing conditions, distributing food and water, cleaning wounds. Soldiers erected tents for shelter. Engineers restored water supplies. Cooks prepared thousands of meals. Sergeant Fairfield, who had discovered the woman in Block 7, found himself assigned as a patient advocate. His job was to stay with the most critical patients, ensure they received care, keep them calm. The woman he'd found, identified from camp records as Mrs. Elizabeth Patterson, a teacher from Manchester, was among the worst cases. Patterson weighed 62 pounds. She stood 5 feet 4 inches tall. Before the war, she'd weighed 130 pounds. She'd lost more than half her body weight. Her heart was failing. Her kidneys were shutting down. Her body was consuming its own organs to stay alive. Dr. Brownlee gave her less than 48 hours to live without immediate intervention. Fairfield stayed by her bedside throughout that first night. Medical teams had established intravenous lines, providing fluids and glucose. But Patterson drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid, sometimes delirious. During the lucid moments, she talked. "I taught mathematics," she whispered. 12-year-olds. They were so bright, so eager. I had a classroom with windows overlooking the harbor. We'd watch the ships come in. I told them stories about where those ships had been. China, India, Australia. She paused, breathing labored. When the Japanese came, we thought we'd be evacuated. Everyone said Singapore couldn't fall. The fortress, they called it. But there weren't enough ships. We waited at the docks with our suitcases. The Japanese soldiers arrived before the ships did. Patterson's voice faded. Fairfield thought she'd slipped back into unconsciousness. Then she spoke again, barely audible. They separated us immediately. Men to one side, women and children to the other. My husband, Peter, was a civil engineer. I saw him for 30 seconds through the fence at Changi, November 1943. He waved. Then he was gone. I learned after the war he died, building that railway. Burma. Cholera. Throughout the camp, similar scenes were unfolding. British soldiers, many of whom had been fighting in Burma or India, found themselves confronting the human cost of Japanese occupation. These were not enemy soldiers they'd met in battle, but civilians, teachers, nurses, shopkeepers, women and children who had committed no crime except being British in the wrong place when war came. The response of the ordinary British soldier to this suffering reveals something profound about military culture and national character. These men had spent years in brutal combat. They'd seen friends killed, witnessed atrocities, developed the hard shell necessary for survival in war. Yet confronted with starving civilians, particularly women and children, that shell cracked. Private Albert Jenkins, 2nd Battalion, Durham Light Infantry, wrote to his mother on September 8th. "We've been giving them our rations, Mum. The Army sends us 3 squares a day, more food than we can eat, truth be told." These women had been eating a handful of rice once daily, if that. "Yesterday, I watched a little girl, couldn't be more than 6, eat a chocolate bar I'd given her. She ate it so slowly, Mum, like she was afraid it might disappear. She asked if she could save half for her sister. Her sister had died 2 months ago. The girl didn't know. She's been saving half her food for a sister who isn't there anymore." The British Army's response to the camps was immediate and comprehensive. Within a week of liberation, the military had established full hospital facilities at Changi, Sim Road, and 3 smaller camps. Over 200 doctors and 600 nurses deployed to Singapore specifically for prisoner care. The Royal Army Medical Corps requisitioned every medical supply in the region. Penicillin, recently mass-produced and still scarce, flowed into Singapore by the ton. The feeding program required particular care. Severe malnutrition makes normal eating dangerous. Refeeding syndrome, when malnourished people eat too much too quickly, can cause heart failure and death. British medical teams implemented careful protocols, small meals, 6 times daily, high-calorie but easily digestible foods, gradual increases as bodies readjusted. The Army established kitchens capable of producing 18,000 meals daily. Menus were carefully planned by military nutritionists: scrambled eggs with milk for protein, porridge with sugar for calories, tinned fruit for vitamins, fresh bread with butter. Small portions initially, slowly increasing. Within 2 weeks, the daily ration had increased from 600 calories to 1,500. Within a month, most women were eating nearly 2,000 calories daily. Captain James Rutherford, Royal Army Service Corps, managed food distribution. His records show the scale of the operation. In the first month after liberation, British forces distributed 300 tons of rice, 50 tons of flour, 40 tons of sugar, 30 tons of meat, 25 tons of butter, and 15 tons of milk powder. Just for the women's camps, thousands of gallons of clean water daily, tons of medical supplies, mountains of soap, clothing, and blankets. The contrast with Japanese provision was stark and intentional. British authorities documented everything, knowing war crimes trials would follow. The evidence was overwhelming. Japanese warehouses held sufficient supplies to have provided adequate rations throughout the war. They simply chose not to. The cruelty was deliberate policy, not wartime necessity. But the British response was about more than providing food and medicine. It was about restoring dignity. Women who had been forced to live in filth, who hadn't bathed properly in years, who wore literal rags, found British soldiers providing not just necessities, but comforts. The Royal Engineers installed showers with hot water. They erected latrines with privacy. They distributed new clothing, not military surplus, but civilian dresses, undergarments, shoes. The quartermasters somehow found cosmetics, mirrors, hairbrushes, small luxuries that meant everything to women who had been stripped of every aspect of normal life. Sister Turner, the nurse from Syme Road, wrote after her recovery, "The first time I looked in an actual mirror, I didn't recognize myself. I'd become an old woman. I was 32 years old, and I looked 60. But the British soldiers, they never showed disgust or pity. They treated us like ladies. They called us ma'am. They helped us walk to the showers and waited outside to help us back. They gave us privacy when we needed it, and company when we needed that instead. They treated us like we were their mothers or sisters, not broken strangers. This instinctive compassion extended beyond basic care. British soldiers spent off-duty hours at the camps, not because they were ordered to, but because they wanted to help. They played with children who hadn't seen a kind adult male in 3 years. They wrote letters for women too weak to hold pens. They shared photographs of their own families, their own homes, reminding these prisoners that normal life still existed. Corporal William Edwards, Royal Welsh Fusiliers, described teaching football to camp children. They'd never played. The Japanese forbade recreation. So we set up goals using bamboo poles and taught them the rules. The first time a little lad scored, he just stood there crying. His mum said he'd forgotten what happiness felt like. We played football every afternoon for a month, started with 12 kids. Within 2 weeks, we had 100. They were still so weak they could barely run, but they tried. They played like their lives depended on remembering how to be children. The recovery was not swift or easy. Severe malnutrition causes damage that takes months or years to reverse. Many women would never fully recover. Some had gone blind from vitamin deficiency. Others suffered permanent heart or kidney damage. Several required amputations due to gangrenous tropical ulcers. The psychological damage was perhaps worse than the physical. Major David Wilson, psychiatrist attached to the Liberation Forces, filed reports documenting widespread post-traumatic stress. Nearly all patients show signs of severe psychological trauma, depression, anxiety, survivor's guilt. Many have witnessed children dying, friends executed, unspeakable cruelty. Some have difficulty believing they're truly safe. They hoard food, hide under beds when aircraft fly overhead, panic when separated from their doctors or nurses. Recovery will take years, if it comes at all. Yet recovery did come, slowly but steadily. By October 1945, most women at Changi had gained 10 to 20 pounds. They could walk unassisted, feed themselves, bathe alone. The hospital wards were emptying as patients graduated to convalescent housing. The British established comfortable facilities at Raffles Hotel and other Singapore buildings, places where former prisoners could continue recovering in dignity while awaiting transport home. Elizabeth Patterson, the teacher Sergeant Fairfield had found in Block 7, made remarkable progress. By late October, she weighed 91 pounds. Still severely underweight, but the immediate danger had passed. Her heart stabilized. Her kidneys recovered. She could sit up, read, engage in conversation. Most importantly, she had begun to hope. Fairfield visited her regularly throughout her recovery. He brought books from the makeshift library the soldiers had assembled. He shared stories from Yorkshire, described his family's farm, talked about his plans after the war. Patterson slowly emerged from her shell, remembering how to smile, occasionally even laughing at Fairfield's terrible jokes. On October 20th, Patterson was deemed well enough for transport to Britain. She would sail on a hospital ship with 200 other recovered prisoners. The morning she left, Fairfield came to say goodbye. Patterson, wearing a proper dress for the first time in 3 years, her hair clean and neatly combed, looked like a different person from the skeleton he'd found in Block 7. "You saved my life," she told him, tears streaming down her face. "When you said, 'You're mine now,' I thought I was being claimed as property again. I'd forgotten humans could show kindness." Fairfield shook his head. "Wasn't just me, ma'am. 200 doctors and nurses, 1,000 soldiers. All of us wanted you to survive. All of us wanted you home." Patterson embraced him, this Yorkshire sergeant who had knelt in filth to give water to a dying stranger. "When you found me," she whispered, I'd given up. I was waiting to die. But you wouldn't let me. You promised you had me. You kept that promise. I'll never forget that. Never. Similar scenes played out across Singapore throughout October, November, as prisoners recovered sufficiently for repatriation. The British organized hospital ships, carefully arranged with medical staff, proper food, comfortable beds. They documented each prisoner's condition, ensuring proper care would continue in Britain. They contacted families when possible, prepared them for what to expect. The scope of the recovery operation was immense. By December 1945, the British had repatriated over 4,000 civilian internees from Singapore camps. Another 2,000 were still too ill for travel and remained under military medical care. The operation continued through early 1946. Every single prisoner received full medical treatment, adequate food, clean clothing, and safe passage home, all paid for by the British government, without question or limit. The cost was staggering. The War Office estimated spending exceeded £2 million, equivalent to over £100 million today. For medical care alone. This didn't include transport, housing, or ongoing care in Britain. Parliament approved every expenditure without debate. These were British subjects who had suffered terribly. Cost was irrelevant. The contrast with Japanese treatment extended beyond the camps themselves. When Allied prisoners were liberated from German camps in Europe, they received good care and repatriation. But the Germans had maintained minimal standards throughout, following Geneva Convention basics, even while committing atrocities elsewhere. In Japanese camps, there had been no standards at all. The difference in mortality rates told the story. 4% in German camps, 25% in Japanese camps in Southeast Asia. This disparity became central to post-war trials. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, convened in Tokyo in 1946, charged multiple Japanese officers with war crimes specifically related to prisoner treatment. Colonel Sumida, the Changi commandant, was convicted and hanged in 1947. Lieutenant General Shenpei Fukuei, who had command authority over all civilian camps in Malaya, received 20 years imprisonment. British survivors testified at these trials, describing conditions in stark detail. Their testimony was supported by British medical documentation, Japanese camp records captured after surrender, and physical evidence, including the camps themselves, preserved as evidence. The tribunal's final judgment stated, "The treatment of Allied prisoners and civilian internees by Japanese forces constituted systematic and deliberate cruelty and violation of all laws of war and human decency." The mortality rates, combined with available evidence of adequate Japanese supplies, prove this cruelty was intentional policy, not wartime necessity. But the trials, important as they were for justice, mattered less to survivors than the simple human kindness shown by their liberators. Nearly every memoir written by Singapore camp, survivors mentions not just the medical care or the food, but the compassion, the gentleness, the determination of ordinary British soldiers to treat broken prisoners as human beings, deserving dignity and respect. Mrs. Violet Woodford, interned at Syme Road with her 3 daughters, wrote in her memoir published in 1953, "We'd been treated like animals for 3 years, less than animals, for the Japanese treated their horses better than us. When the British soldiers arrived, they looked at us with such sadness and anger on our behalf. They were furious at what had been done to us, but their fury was protective, not frightening. They wanted to help, to fix things, to make us whole again. I watched young soldiers, boys really, 20 or 21 years old, spoon-feeding women too weak to feed themselves, bathing patients too ill to bathe alone, sitting with dying prisoners, holding their hands, ensuring they didn't die alone. This wasn't military duty. This was human decency. This was British soldiers showing the values they'd been fighting for all along. The long-term impact of the Singapore camp liberation extended far beyond the immediate rescues. The documentation of Japanese war crimes influenced post-war policy toward Japan. The treatment of survivors shaped British approaches to trauma care and recovery. The stories told by prisoners and liberators influenced public understanding of the Pacific War, ensuring it wasn't forgotten in the focus on European liberation. Many survivors maintained lifelong connections with their liberators. Sergeant Fairfield and Elizabeth Patterson corresponded for 40 years until his death in 1985. She attended his funeral in Yorkshire, meeting his children and grandchildren, telling them about the day their father gave water to a dying woman in a Singapore prison and promised she was safe now. He was 24 years old, Patterson told them. Just a lad, really. But he had such gentle strength. He'd seen terrible things in Burma, I learned later. Lost friends, witnessed atrocities. But he didn't let it make him hard. When he saw suffering, he responded with kindness. That's who he was. That's who Britain was in that moment. We'd lost everything. Our homes, our health, often our families. But Britain sent soldiers who cared, who tried to fix what had been broken, who promised they had us now and meant it. The medical outcomes of the liberation exceeded all expectations. Of the 3,000 women and children at Changi in September 1945, over 95% survived to reach Britain. Given that dozens were within days or hours of death when found, this survival rate was remarkable. The British medical teams had saved hundreds of lives through rapid intervention, adequate supplies, and skilled care. The contrast with what would have happened without liberation is stark. Medical analyses after the war concluded that without intervention, over 70% of Changi prisoners would have died within 6 months. Malnutrition, disease, and complete absence of medical care guaranteed it. The Japanese surrender came just in time. Weeks later would have been too late for hundreds. In 1955, on the 10th anniversary of liberation, survivors organized a reunion in London. Over 500 former prisoners attended, along with more than 200 medical staff and soldiers who had participated in the liberation. Elizabeth Patterson gave the keynote address. She stood before the crowd, healthy now, a headmistress at a Manchester grammar school, and spoke about September 5th, 1945. I remember so little of those final days before liberation, she said. Malnutrition damages memory, they tell me. But I remember Sergeant Fairfield kneeling beside me. I remember thinking he was an angel come to carry me away. I remember him saying, "You're mine now." In my delirium, those words meant safety, protection, care. He was claiming responsibility for me, promising I wouldn't be abandoned again. Patterson paused, looking around the room at the hundreds gathered. Every person in this room had a Sergeant Fairfield, someone who found them, who gave them water or food or medicine, who sat with them during the night, who promised they were safe now. Those promises were kept. We were carried from hell to healing by ordinary British soldiers who responded to suffering with compassion. That's the Britain I learned to love again. The Britain worth surviving for. The Britain that never forgot its people, even when they were lost in a Singapore prison, starving and forgotten by the world. The statistics tell part of the story. 3,200 women and children liberated from Changi, 2,100 from Sime Road, nearly 700 from smaller camps, over 6,000 British civilians total, saved from certain death by rapid military intervention and comprehensive medical care. The British government spent over £2 million on rescue and recovery operations. More than 200 doctors and 600 nurses deployed specifically for prisoner care. 18,000 meals prepared daily for 3 months. Tons of medical supplies, clothing, and necessities distributed free of charge. but numbers alone can't capture what happened in Singapore in autumn 1945. What those numbers represent is a moral choice. Britain, exhausted by 6 years of war, facing massive reconstruction needs at home, chose to spend millions on rescuing prisoners who could contribute nothing to victory. The war was over. Saving these people had no strategic value. It was done simply because it was right. The British soldiers who liberated the camps gained nothing material from their compassion. They weren't rewarded or promoted for the hours spent with patients. They received no special recognition for sharing rations or playing football with traumatized children. They did it because confronted with suffering, they chose to help. That choice, repeated thousands of times across Singapore in autumn 1945, saved thousands of lives. Thomas Fairfield returned to his Yorkshire farm after the war. He married, raised 3 children, lived a quiet life. He rarely spoke about Singapore, as many veterans didn't speak about their war. But his daughter found his diary after his death, and it contained one entry about Block 7. September 5th, 1945. Found a woman today, more skeleton than person. Gave her water. She was terrified at first. I told her she was mine now, that I had her. She drank. She thanked me. I don't know if she'll survive the night. I hope she does. I hope all of them do. They've suffered enough. We got here just in time, I think. Another month, and there wouldn't have been anyone left to save. Thank God we got here when we did. Elizabeth Patterson survived another 41 years. She taught mathematics until retirement in 1978. She never married, never had children, but influenced thousands of students with her gentle wisdom and quiet strength. When she died in 1986, her will specified that donations should go to charities supporting refugees and displaced persons. I was a refugee once, her will stated. Starving, broken, certain I would die. Someone saved me. Someone promised he had me now and kept that promise. The least I can do is help others who are lost, the way I was lost, until someone finds them and promises they're safe now. The liberation of Singapore's camps stands as testimony to both the worst and best of human nature, the calculated cruelty of the Japanese camp system, the systematic starvation and neglect that killed thousands, the complete absence of mercy or compassion, but also the rapid British response, the comprehensive medical care, the gentle treatment of broken prisoners, the determination to save everyone possible, regardless of cost. When Sergeant Thomas Fairfield knelt beside Elizabeth Patterson in Block 7 and said, "You're mine now," he was making a promise on behalf of a nation. Britain wouldn't abandon its people, wouldn't let them die forgotten in a foreign prison, would spend whatever necessary to bring them home alive. That promise was kept. 3,000 times at Changi alone, 6,000 times across Singapore, tens of thousands of times across Asia as British forces liberated camp after camp. The story of liberation is ultimately simple. People were dying. Britain sent soldiers to save them. Those soldiers succeeded. They succeeded because they had the resources, the organization, and most importantly, the will to treat suffering human beings with dignity and compassion. They succeeded because when confronted with starving prisoners, British soldiers chose to share their rations. When they saw children traumatized by years of cruelty, they chose to play football and teach laughter. When they found women too weak to feed themselves, they chose to sit for hours, patiently spoon-feeding them back to life. September 5th, 1945, was not the end of suffering for Singapore's prisoners. Recovery took months or years. Some never fully healed. But it was the day hope returned, the day the prison gates opened and British soldiers walked in, the day promises were made. "You're safe now. You're mine now. I've got you." and the day those promises began to be kept. In the arithmetic of war, these rescues changed nothing. Victory was already assured. The strategic situation was unchanged. But in the arithmetic of humanity, these rescues changed everything. 6,000 lives saved. 6,000 people who went home to Britain rebuilt their lives, influenced thousands more through their teaching, nursing, parenting, and simple existence. The ripples of compassion extended across generations. That is the true measure of what happened in Singapore in autumn 1945. Not just lives saved, but humanity restored. Not just bodies healed, but spirits mended. Not just prisoners liberated, but dignity returned to people who had been stripped of everything human except the will to survive. Britain sent soldiers who saw that will and chose to honor it, who promised protection and delivered it, who said, "You're mine now," and meant, "You're safe, you're valued, you're going home." And they kept that promise, every single one.